Are you learning CSS basics for beginners? I want to find a simple example about CSS Grid. If so, you're in the right place. CSS Grid. CSS Grid gives us an easy way to lay things out in web pages in rows and columns, like in a spreadsheet. Using CSS Grid, we can easily make fully responsive website layouts. We simply set the elements wherever we want to put them: headers, footers, asides, and sections. Also, it's supported in all modern browsers. We have the grid container and grid items. The grid container is just set to grid, and the items then act like cells inside that grid. Here we can see an example of a website, and the red shows where the grid system is. We can see there's a grid part on the top, then the main content. We can see there's a column, grid left and right with nothing, and then the content is in the middle. On the bottom then we can see one wide grid element. For these examples, we'll be using the examples CSS.css file and also the examples.html file. On the left, we can see them in VsCode. And in the web development project on the right, we can see we have to click on the examples button and scroll down to the example that we're working on. Here we can see what we're going to be doing in the next example, CSS Grid example. On the left, we can see the HTML and CSS, and on the right, we can see the browser. We can see we'll have a header. That's actually H2. Then the main content is a H2 with a paragraph of text, and then a footer on the bottom. All created very quickly and easily with CSS Grid. So let's have a look at the code before we go into VsCode. Here we can see we have the CSS Grid example. We have a section. The main class, grid example main, that's just going to be set to grid. Then everything inside that, we can see the aside, which is where the content is, has a class on it called grid example content. Basically, the content is going to be given a particular order, a particular row and column to go into the main grid. We can see then the next two parts for the main content and footer are just the same. There's a main grid, then the content is slotted into the grid inside that in two cells. Here we can see the CSS. So for the main grid, we just have display grid. Then here's the interesting part, the columns. We have grid template columns. This is new to us. We're saying we want one column with one fraction. Then we want a column in the middle with min max. In other words, a minimum width and a maximum width set. We can see the minimum, because it's left in the bracket, is auto, and maximum of 40 EM. And then one fraction on the right hand side. So looking at this, we can see the min-max is 40 EM wide, so we'll have a column in the middle 40 EM wide. Minimum 40 EM, a maximum of whatever. Then we have one fraction left and right of that, so they'll naturally be divided up with the same width like we saw in the screenshot. So we'll have the content in the middle of our page, basically. On the bottom then, the grid example content, we can see the actual content as grid column set to 2, 3. This means all the content goes into the main grid in column 2 and 3. We just have a border set to black to show it to us, then text align center to make it look nice. We'll also go and have a look when we have it created in Chrome Developer Tools. We can see here the grid. You can actually click on the grid on the right hand side in Chrome Developer Tool Elements and see it'll show you where all the grid elements are and the columns, and we can check the CSS also. Hi, before we move on, please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe so you don't miss out on any upcoming videos. Thank you. So here we are in the CSS Grid example. On the left, I have the examples HTML file on the bottom. On the top, I have the examples CSS.css file. So you can see on the bottom here, I just have some comments put in if you want to do that too, just to make it look nicer and keep the code separated. So for CSS Grid, this example, we're going to have a header, main content, and a footer in a quick layout website just to see how it works in CSS Grid. So for this, let's start by creating a section. And let's put a class in this section and call it grid example main. This would be the main grid. Class equals grid hyphen example main. So this will contain a main grid. So now we want content inside that. So let's create an aside inside it for content. Aside. And let's show ourselves now that this is the actual content class. So let's call it grid example content class. Class equals grid example content. So inside here now, let's put in some actual content. Let's put in a H2. And we'll call this, we'll just write in header. So on the right hand side, once you click save CTRL-S on your project and refresh in your browser, you can see on the right hand side we have the header H2 there now. So we're going to have three sections in this: the header, the main content, and the footer. So a handy thing we can do here, we'll just copy what we've just done and change the internal content to main content and one to footer. So let's copy this section. Let's just paste it underneath. I'll just expand this up here a bit. And now let's have this as the main content. So let's put in main content in the H2. And save CTRL and S and refresh on your browser. Now let's go ahead and paste that underneath again and change the content H2 to footer. And we can see on the right in our browser we now have header, main content, and footer. That's great. Let's just put in a paragraph here of text in the main content. P for paragraph. And let's just put in some text. Now, so far we have those three elements: a main grid with another content inside that grid. Now let's go up and have a look at our CSS. We'll leave this there so that we can see it nice and handy. So the first class we have to create is the container one, grid example main. So if you want, you can just copy the class name from here. We go dot to signify we're creating a class, and then paste, open curly brackets, open and close brackets. Now for this container class, we want it to display grid. So we type in display grid, G for grid. And we can see on the right it just moved slightly. I'll just scroll down here. So what else do we want to do? Well, we naturally want to have columns set in our grid. So here comes the interesting part. Now let's set columns. So remember, we want a generic column, one on the left, one on the right. That'll be whatever width, but the middle one, we want to hold our content a specific width. That way the content all looks the same in the middle, and left and right will expand and shrink if the page increases and decreases size. So let's go grid, template, columns. You can see it there, we hit enter. Now for the first column, we'll just go 1F, F for fraction, 1FR, 1FR. For the next column, we want a minimum and a maximum. We want the minimum to be auto, in other words, it'll shrink, and the maximum to be 40 EM. We don't want the content going too big. So let's just type min-max. We can see the min-max function opens up. We hit enter. We have brackets. So we want the minimum to be auto, comma, and then space, and the maximum to be, we'll set it for 40 EM. That's 40 EM. 1 EM is the default text size set in the CSS. So let's set it for 40 EM wide. And now we need a column on the right. Well, the same as the left one. one fraction on the right, 1 FR. And we're going to click Save. Now that's the CSS for the main grid. So let's just have a look at that again. Display grid. Grid template columns, put in these columns, one on the left of one fraction, one on the right of one fraction, and then a column in the middle with a minimum of automatic so that it'll squash down, and a maximum of 40 EM. We don't want to go above 40 EM wide. Now, we can see now we obviously have to fill in the CSS class for grid example content. So let's copy that class. And just in our CSS file, we're going to go dot, paste in the class, open, close curly brackets. So what do we want to do with our content? Well, we know we have a blank column on the left, blank on the right, and we want the content in the middle. So if you look at the column numbers, the first line is going to be 1. The start of this column is going to be 2. And the start of the end column is going to be 3, if you were to put lines on the columns and rows. So let's see what happens then if we place this class, which is the content, in grid column 2/3. We want it to go from column 2 to column 3, in other words, the middle. So go grid-c for column. We're going to go 2/3. There we can see on the right now it's actually moved into the middle. Now, in order to view this a bit more handy, we're going to go a little bit further now. And let's just put a border around the grid example content. So all the content has a border so we can actually see where it is on the page. So we're going to go border. Let's say 1 pixel solid black. And Ctrl and S for save or refresh on your browser. And we can see now that all the content has a border around it. And we can see a space indeed on the left and the right where other columns are. How cool is that? Now let's just go one step further and just text align the header, main content and footer into the middle to make it look a bit nicer. So we're going to go text -align, C for center, and Ctrl and S in VsCode and refresh on your browser. And we can see now we have the header, main content and footer. So now let's just verify that now and see what we can do with DevTools just to have a look at what we've actually done. So I'm going to expand this window. And F12 on Windows goes into Developer Tools. And here we can see, let's just right click anywhere and click Inspect and it'll go to that in the Developer Tools on the right. So here we can see when we scroll down, grid example. And I can turn off these grid buttons here. Anytime DevTools finds a grid in a website, it gives you the option to turn it on and off to see what columns you've actually got. So we can see here, if we hover over the first one, grid main column. We can see on the right what's set up, display grid, and grid template columns, 1 fraction, auto 40 EM and 1 fraction. So basically there's the main grid once, there it is twice, there it is 3 times. So let's turn on the grid here when we hover over it on the right hand side. We can see now that Chrome is showing us line 1 is at the start of our grid, line 2 of course is at the end of that column and the start of the next column, and line 3 is at the end of that column and the start of the next column, and line 4 is at the end of that last column. Remember, we put our content in grid column 2/3. That means from this 2 here over to here, 3. Grid column 2/3. That's where our content lives. So let's just click on this one next here. We can see we have the same thing. We can turn on the grid on this and turn off on the top. Again, it's the same thing. Grid line 1, 2, 3, 4. We have a column on the left, one in the middle, one on the right. And our content, which we've seen already, is in grid column 2/3. We can see the number 2 here and the line 3 here. All our content is placed in the middle. How cool is that? Hi, I hope you found this video helpful. If so, please like, share, comment and subscribe so you don't miss out on any upcoming videos in the Web Development for Beginners playlist. See you next time.